This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Tonight is a topic that's been in the news a lot lately, and I think it affects many levels of society, looking at traumatic brain injury and the entity of chronic traumatic encephalopathy that a lot of people have read about in the New York Times and in other newspapers on the news. And we have two experts in this area talking tonight. Raquel Gardner is an assistant professor of neurology in the Memory and Aging Center, and now working with Christine Yaffe, who you heard from, I think, in the second group of lectures at the VA Medical Center. And Raquel has a background, was trained in Harvard and came to UCSF for her neurology residency, did her behavioral neurology fellowship with us, and then went to work with Christine Yaffe, looking more at the epidemiology of neurodegenerative diseases, including traumatic brain injury at the VA. And then the other speaker tonight is Gil Rabinovich. Gil did his training here, his residency here in neurology, came to do a fellowship with us at the Memory and Aging Center, and I've watched him rise to really become one of the world leaders now in imaging in neurodegenerative disease. Gil just got a very large grant to look at a new imaging modality to be tested by Medicare, and he's running a study, I think it's a $100 million study that he's director of. So really has just become a world leader in imaging, and he'll be talking, he's very interested in early onset Alzheimer's disease, atypical presentations of neurodegenerative disease, and looking at biomarkers, ways of making the diagnosis of these brain diseases earlier so that when we do have treatments, we'll be able to intervene as early as possible. And he also has a great interest. He's a big sports fan. I think he's a Cubs fan, if I recall. And so anything to do with sports and sports injuries, he's very interested in. That's what led him to talk about some of the things he'll be talking about tonight. So I think we're starting with Raquel and then Gil.
Thanks, Michael. It's an honor to speak to you all tonight. I think this will be really fun for both of us. And I'll be talking to you mainly about the impact of single traumatic brain injury on the aging brain. And then my colleague, Dr. Rabinovich, will be focusing more on the impacts of repetitive or repeated traumatic brain injuries and concussions. And so I should possibly warn you that throughout the talk, I'm going to be asking you to sort of stretch your mind a little bit into sort of different types of logical thinking, and we may see some number crunching as well. And so it should be interesting. So the outline, first I'll give a little bit of background about traumatic brain injury. We'll refer to this as TBI moving forward. Second, we'll talk about TBI and the risk of degenerative brain diseases or neurodegenerative disease. And I'll throw in some research methodology in there as well. And then finally, we'll end off with a case study, just to illustrate some of what we have discussed and learned. All right, so first, what is traumatic brain injury? What is TBI? So typically, it's thought of as brain dysfunction that's caused by an outside force, usually a blow to the head. You can have mild TBI, which many people also refer to as concussion. So when someone says concussion, it's essentially synonymous with mild TBI, and is usually defined as a brain dysfunction caused by an outside force where either there is no loss of consciousness, the person is not knocked out, or they're knocked out only for a few minutes, less than 30 minutes, which still seems like a sort of long time. And so mild TBI is actually a fairly heterogeneous condition in and of itself, because you can imagine someone who's not knocked out might have a much milder TBI than someone who was knocked out for 29 and a half minutes. The next category is moderate to severe TBI, and this includes people who've had a more extended loss of consciousness. These people were knocked out for 30 or more minutes. So, as some of you may have read in the news, as TBI is becoming more of sort of a topic, TBI is very common and very costly, both globally and for the US specifically. So every year, about 2.5 million people in the US seek medical care for traumatic brain injury. Many more suffer TBI but don't seek care. And so this is really a big underestimate, and particularly for people who suffer more mild TBIs or concussions, this is probably a gross underestimate of the true burden of this disease. Up to 40% of adults report having suffered at least one TBI at some point in their lives. So this is quite common. The estimated annual cost of TBI in the United States exceeds $70 billion, and this is taking into account not only the hospital costs, but then sort of the long-term costs that will come into play when someone has disability or other more long-term deficits or issues. So what causes traumatic brain injury? So this is a pie chart from the Centers for Disease Control, which basically shows the leading causes of TBI. And while based on what the lay press might lead you to believe, the biggest cause of TBI is actually falls. It's not boxing, it's not actually football. Sorry, Gil. And it's not even necessarily military related traumatic brain injuries. It's really falls, and that's across the age spectrum, both in young people and older people. Other very common causes are motor vehicle accidents, people who've been struck by an object or hit their head against an object, people who are assaulted, and then sort of a category of other and unknown, which can include a number of other things, or that the cause wasn't tracked. So the question is, what are these falls exactly? So this is just a big category that would include any kind of a fall. If someone fell from standing, that would be included in this category. If someone maybe was on a stationary bicycle and fell off of it. I imagine if they were on the bicycle and then ran into something, they might be included in either the motor vehicle category or the struck against category. And so this is really people who were neither in a motor vehicle accident or struck by against, but in some way were falling. And it could be from standing or from a height, falling from a ladder, falling from a window, things like that. Great question. So surprisingly, as well, the highest rates of hospitalization for TBI in the United States actually occur in older adults. So this is a graph which you can see my mouse, on the y-axis shows the number per 100,000. So this is the number of cases per 100,000 people in the United States. And on the x-axis here, you have age group. And then each of these lines denotes a different type of event. So the lowest one is the number of deaths. So luckily, it's on the lowest end and stays relatively stable, though there's a little bit of a rise as people get older. The next one is hospitalization. So people who suffer a TBI and then are hospitalized for treatment. So you can see that it's a little bit higher for very small children. There's a little blip for teenagers. But the biggest increase is really once people reach the age of 65 and above. So the highest rates of hospitalization are in people 65 and above. For ER visits, it's a little different, much higher rates among very small children, a big blip for people in their teens and early 20s, and then again, a blip for people that are older. So I wanted to introduce this article to you, partially because these masks will be illustrating aspects of this presentation, but because I thought it was a really beautifully done and very interesting article published earlier this year by National Geographic that basically shows and discusses and describes masks that were made by U.S. military personnel who suffered traumatic brain injuries during their deployments. And it was part of an art therapy project. And each participant created a mask that expressed how he or she felt about their traumatic brain injury in some way, it expressed what they were feeling or going through. And you can find it at this website online if you want to see all of the masks and the discussion. Here are just a select few that show, I think, perhaps better than words, what some people experience after a traumatic brain injury. So this sort of leads us in to the meat of the talk, which is that TBI is often more than just a one-time event. So while TBI may cause immediate deficits and impairments in cognition, in mood, in movement, and in everyday function, and that these may occur to varying degrees or last for varying durations for different people, there is growing evidence that TBI may also lead to a more progressive decline. So symptoms that actually don't just stay static, but actually worsen over time. So in one interesting study, up to 40% of patients admitted to a rehabilitation hospital for treatment of TBI reported progressively worsening functional decline 5 years later. And this was across all ages. Granted, these were the more severely injured folks with TBI because they were actually admitted not only to a hospital, but then to a rehabilitation hospital for an extended period of time. Furthermore, people with TBI may be more likely to get degenerative brain disease. So this brings us to topic number 2, which is TBI and degenerative brain disease. So because not everyone, I think, was at the dementia and neurodegenerative talks that were already given, I'll just briefly define what I mean by degenerative brain disease, which in medical lingo is often called neurodegenerative disease. So this is typically an aging-related dysfunction and death of specific brain cells, ultimately leading to neurological symptoms, brain shrinkage, and death. And here you can see a picture of a healthy brain on the left and a brain affected by Alzheimer's disease on the right. And basically you can see it's a bit smaller. There's certain specific areas that you could home in on and discuss that are specifically targeted in Alzheimer's disease. So there are different flavors of neurodegenerative disease. There's dementia, which targets mainly cognition and behavior, the most common type being Alzheimer's disease. There's a category of movement disorders which affect movement and specifically regulation of movement, often producing slowness of movement overall, slowness of walking and falls. The most common kind being Parkinson's disease, or PD. And there's a category of motor neuron diseases, the most well-known type being Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, which causes progressive weakness in the body. So the question is, does TBI cause dementia? We'll start there. So many, but not all previous studies have found that people with TBI are more likely to get dementia later. So what you see here is a figure from what's called a meta-analysis, which basically takes a bunch of different studies that have all tried to answer this question: is TBI associated with dementia? And then sort of averages them all together to see if you put them all together, what do they all say? What's the average, essentially? And so each box here depicts one study, and this diamond at the bottom is the average of all of these studies. So this is an average of 15 different studies that were trying to answer this question. The actual result provided is something called an odds ratio. So here's where we'll get into a little bit of method. So we're going to leave this graph for just a minute, but then we'll come right back to it to finish sort of discussing the take-home point. So what are odds? What is an odds ratio? So first, I think to understand odds, we should discuss sort of odds versus probability. So odds is the number who have an event divided by the number who don't have the event. Probability, which is roughly equivalent to risk, when people talk about their risk, they're really talking about their probability of something happening, is a little bit different than odds. So that's the number with the event divided by the total number of everybody with and without the event. So just to illustrate this, if an event occurs 2 out of 5 times, the odds would be 2 divided by 3, or 0.67. If an event occurs 2 out of 5 times, then the probability would be 2 divided by 5, the total. So the probability is 0.4. And so for a variety of reasons, mainly historical, in medical research, people often talk about odds and odds ratios. So I just wanted to illustrate to you that that isn't exactly the same thing as risk, although it's similar, particularly when you're talking about numbers that are kind of close to 1. So we'll head back to our figure here. So the odds ratio here, what that means is the odds of dementia in people with TBI divided by the odds of dementia in people without TBI. And what this meta-analysis shows, so what I'm pointing now with this little red arrow, is that the 1, so all the studies to the right of the 1 show an increased odds of dementia after TBI. All of the studies, which are those boxes to the left of the 1, show a decreased risk of dementia after TBI. So you can see most of them fall to the right, and the average is 1.5. So what we can say based on 15 studies that have been done to look at this question is that overall, people with TBI had 1.5 or so times the odds of developing dementia compared to those without TBI. So here's a similar study that was done looking at this question relating to Parkinson's disease. So many, but not all prior studies found that people with TBI are also more likely to get Parkinson's disease or PD. So as you can see here, each study is a red dot, and then the summary, or the average, is all the way at that bottom one. So the odds ratio here is the odds of Parkinson's disease in people with TBI divided by the odds of Parkinson's disease in people without TBI. And so the average here is also about 1.5. So overall, people with TBI had about 1.5 times the odds of developing PD compared to those without TBI. Okay, so then we have to ask, all right, so does TBI cause dementia and Parkinson's disease? So most of these studies have compared people with TBI to otherwise healthy people without TBI and then measured how many got dementia or how many got PD, Parkinson's disease, in each group. People with TBI got more dementia and more Parkinson's disease. So we can basically say TBI is correlated with dementia and Parkinson's disease. What could explain this correlation? What could explain this finding that in many people who have TBI, they go on to get dementia and PD? So I'll present 3 possibilities, and there may be many, many more, but we'll talk about 3 for now. So possibility number 1 is TBI causes Parkinson's disease and dementia. This would be an example of causation. Possibility number 2, which is also perhaps equally possible. So in the earliest stages of Parkinson's disease and dementia, people often have subtle symptoms that are then not diagnosed as Parkinson's disease and dementia until many, many years later. And so one could imagine that someone in the very earliest stages of, say, Parkinson's disease is having a little bit of trouble walking, would be more likely to fall and suffer a traumatic brain injury that would only then be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease a few years later. So we would call this reverse causation. And this would basically, in a study like the ones that we've just looked at, could be construed as a correlation between TBI and Parkinson's disease or dementia that appears to be causal, but perhaps is not. So the final possibility that we'll talk about is one called confounding. So in this situation, people who just lead riskier lives are a little bit more likely to get a traumatic brain injury. But people who lead riskier lives might also be a little bit more likely to get Parkinson's disease and dementia. And so the actual causative factor here is risky behavior. And this is creating the appearance of an association between TBI and Parkinson's disease or dementia, when in fact there's no direct causal association, because both of those things are actually caused by something else entirely. So we call this confounding. And so clinical research is not as simple or easy as it looks. So why is this important? Why is it important to figure out if these other factors are at play? So we want to know if TBI is what's called an independent risk factor, meaning it independently increases risk for dementia and Parkinson's disease, rather than simply reflecting a spurious association due to things like reverse causation or confounding, like we just discussed, right? If TBI is truly an independent risk factor, independently increases risk for dementia and PD, then this would suggest that the association may be causal. It would help us build the case that the association is really causal. So how could we, in an ideal world, design a study to figure out if TBI causes dementia or PD? So we'll do a little mental exercise. So in research, we talk about interventional studies, which often, perhaps some in the audience have heard about randomized controlled trials. So in this situation, you basically randomly assign a group of people to either getting your intervention or not, and then you follow them to see what happens. So this is what people do in laboratory science with their mice. And it's a great way to reduce the possibility of reverse causation and confounding, because you're just randomly assigning your exposure to different people. So what if we recruit a group of healthy people and randomly assign them to receive a traumatic brain injury or not, and then follow them and see what happens? Anyone going for that idea? So as you probably realize, this would not go over very well with our ethics committee here at UCSF. So I have a better idea. And this is actually an even better study. So we identify a group of people, and maybe, if we can't give them a traumatic brain injury, maybe we find a group of people who already had one. And then we follow those people for a few years, see what happens. Then we travel back in time, and we save those people from having their traumatic brain injury. We prevent them. So they have now not had a traumatic brain injury, and we follow them forward in time and see what happens. So we're essentially comparing the exact same people to each other. The only difference is that person in this era, but the same person had a TBI and the other person didn't, right? So unfortunately, this also is not generally possible. And so what we are left with, oftentimes in medical research where we can't actually perform an intervention such as giving people a traumatic brain injury or traveling back in time, is that we try to design a study where we just observe people, an observational study that mimics a randomized controlled trial, like the ones that we just discussed. So the key here is really to find a comparison group or a control group that is as similar as possible to your TBI or case group, and then compare these groups moving forward. You can then use sort of fancy statistics to account for any potential confounders that may be left over that still differ between your cases and controls, because it's often hard to make the groups perfectly similar. Along with Christine Yaffe and others at UCSF, and the University of Michigan, we were thinking, well, traumatic brain injury is so common in older adults. We really want to know if traumatic brain injury sustained in older or middle adulthood is really an independent risk factor for dementia or Parkinson's disease. So how could we figure this out? Who should we compare these people to? So we know that among all ages, the most common cause of TBI is falls, and in fact, in older adults, it's the vast majority of cases. So we saw, I think, about 40% of all ages, but once you get into older adults, it's more on the order of 70% due to falls. So who could we compare to? So we had this idea of comparing to older adults who had broken a limb, which, as you can imagine, is also often due to falls. And so we thought this would be a good way of coming up with two groups of people, one of whom had a traumatic brain injury, one of whom didn't, but were otherwise very similar, maybe even had the same types of risky behaviors, if you will, between the groups, the same chances of falling. So we identified a group of over 150,000 adults aged 55 and older, about 50,000 of whom had a TBI, and about 100,000 of whom had broken a limb that had received care in California hospitals. We did this by looking at electronic medical records from California state hospitals that are collected by this organization called the Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project. It turned out that in both groups, 66% of the injuries were in fact due to falls, so the group seemed pretty similar. We then followed these patients for 5 to 7 years and compared the rate of dementia and Parkinson's disease in each group. And our analyses were adjusted for many potential confounders that could lead to Parkinson's disease or dementia, or might be associated also with traumatic brain injury. So we were trying to think of other potential confounders. In the end, we found that compared to adults 55 and older who broke a limb, similar adults who were 55 and older who suffered a traumatic brain injury were about 26% more likely to get dementia. And here we didn't use the odds ratio we saw before. We used something called the hazard ratio, which is a little more similar to risk. So about 26% more likely to get dementia and about 44% more likely to get Parkinson's disease over the next 5 to 7 years. So, which sounds sort of like a lot. But to sort of make this a little bit more real, I thought we would illustrate with a case study. So Mrs. T is a lovely 72-year-old woman who recently slipped on a loose rug in her home, hit her head, and suffered a concussion, aka a mild TBI. She was evaluated in an emergency room and cleared, but her family thinks she has been a bit more forgetful since the fall. Her primary doctor refers her to a neurologist who specializes in memory disorders. She says, "Doctor, I've seen some things on TV about football players getting concussions and then getting a terrible dementia-like brain disease, which you will hear more about in a few minutes. Am I going to get this disease?" So what does science have to say? So luckily, the study we just discussed was really focusing in on this exact situation, an older adult who fell and suffered a traumatic brain injury. So we can say, well, maybe Mrs. T may be 26% more likely to get dementia and 44% more likely to get Parkinson's disease over the next 5 to 7 years compared to a similar adult who fell and broke a limb. But this brings us to another important methodological topic, which is relative versus absolute risk. So just to illustrate using a very simple example, if I have 1 peanut and Dr. Rabinovich has 2 peanuts, so he actually has 200% as many peanuts as I do, which sounds like a lot, right? But in reality, he only has 1 more peanut than I do, which is not very much, right? So in our situation here with Mrs. T, in the relative camp, compared to people who fell and broke a limb, Mrs. T is 26% more likely to get dementia and 44% more likely to get Parkinson's disease over the next 5 to 7 years. But what's the absolute risk? What is the absolute number of people for whom this actually occurs? It turns out it's very small. So in the study I just described, I didn't give you these numbers initially, but out of the whole group of people who suffered TBI and the whole group of people who suffered a broken limb, 8.4% of those with TBI went on to get dementia, and 5.9% of those with a broken limb went on to get dementia. So what's the difference? So the absolute difference in the level of risk, right? The absolute amount of risk that Mrs. T has because she hit her head instead of breaking her arm is only 2.5% more, right? Risk of getting dementia. What about Parkinson's disease? So in that group, the numbers were even smaller because Parkinson's disease is a much more uncommon condition than dementia. So 1.7% of the TBI group and only 1.1% of the broken limb group went on to get Parkinson's disease. So what's the difference here? The added risk that Mrs. T has because she hit her head rather than breaking her leg. 0.6%, very small. So who cares about post-TBI neurodegenerative diseases, right? One could ask that question. So this brings us to sort of the final methodological piece here, which is the idea of individual versus global impact of a particular exposure or disease. So even though 2.5% and 0.6% seem like small numbers and suggests that Mrs. T's absolute risk is very small for getting dementia or Parkinson's disease as a result of her concussion, it's estimated that 15 million older adults around the world suffer TBI every year. And like I said at the beginning, this is probably a gross underestimate. So here's a little math. So if we take 15 million times 2.5%, we get 375,000 people. Then we take 15 million times 0.6%, which is the added risk for Parkinson's disease, we get 90,000. We add those all together, and we come up with nearly 500,000 older adults who may go on to develop dementia or PD due to a TBI sustained every year, right? So this ends up being a fairly large number when you translate it into the global population. So what would I say to Mrs. Greene if she came to see me in my clinic? I would probably say something along the lines of this, which is that luckily, most people, the vast majority with a concussion, don't get dementia. But your concussion makes your brain a bit more vulnerable to getting dementia than if you hadn't had the concussion. Let's talk about ways we can optimize your brain health moving forward. And I would also like to see you back in a few months to see how you're doing and repeat some memory tests. So future directions for this area of research in medicine, I think, is to really figure out why it is that some people with a previous TBI get degenerative brain disease, while others, the vast majority, are resilient. So in order to do this, we need to figure out what are the additional factors that increase the risk of getting degenerative brain disease after a traumatic brain injury. Maybe they're genetic factors, maybe they're other health factors or other exposures that people have. What are the mechanisms of neurodegenerative disease in this population? And only then can we figure out how to treat and prevent post-TBI degenerative brain disease. So here at UCSF, we have a number of studies. These are just a few that I'm involved with where we're looking at these questions in detail. One you'll hear about, I think, a bit more from Dr. Rabinovich studying retired NFL players. There's a large effort called Track TBI, which is nationwide, run by Jeff Manley here at UCSF in neurosurgery, which is following 3,000 patients with TBI over the course of a year and hopefully even longer to understand what happens to them on many levels using all kinds of genetic and biomarker, looking at their genes and other molecular features. And the BRAVE study, which is a study specifically in veterans who have sustained a traumatic brain injury and understanding how they fare as they age. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank the UCSF Memory and Aging Center, the San Francisco VA, and the folks there, including Bruce Miller, Gil, who's here, Christine Yaffe, my mentor and collaborator as well at San Francisco General Hospital, Jeff Manley, the Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project, and my funding sources. Thanks very much. So I'll hand it over now to Gil for the second half.
So I'm going to talk about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a progressive dementia that's associated with repetitive head trauma. And I think it's probably a coincidence that this talk was scheduled during the big game week between Cal and Stanford, but maybe not. So whether or not you're a sports fan, whether your main source of information is the New York Times or ESPN's Sports Center, I think it's been hard to miss the many, many stories of fallen sports heroes that have been reported in the media in the last few years. These are usually stories about football stars or hockey stars who have suffered a devastating neurological and psychiatric decline after retirement and are found to have a deadly brain disease called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or abbreviated as CTE. And I picked just one of the more famous stories. This is Junior Seau. He was an iconic figure in San Diego, where he spent most of his 20 years playing linebacker for the San Diego Chargers. He was a well-known civic figure, a great citizen. He had no reported history of concussions during his 17-year career, and he retired in 2010. But even near the end of his playing career, he was suffering from very significant psychiatric and neurologic symptoms. He had insomnia, depression, he was behaving erratically, he had delusions, reports of domestic violence, alcohol abuse, gambling. These worsened and worsened, and he shot himself in the chest in 2012 at age 43. And shooting oneself in the chest, if you're a retired NFL player, is code for "I want my brain examined after death for signs of CTE." And in fact, the NIH examined his brain and found evidence of this disease. So this is just one of many similar stories that have been reported in the press. So I thought I'd begin today's lecture by providing some historical perspective. I'll then define a little more, build on what Dr. Gardner reported, and define concussions and subconcussive blows from a medical point of view. I'll spend most of the talk talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. I'll show brain pathology, so I will show images of postmortem brains. If that's disturbing to you, you probably shouldn't stay. I'll show microscopic features. I'll discuss clinical features, imaging findings. I'm going to focus a lot on American football, but I'll talk a little bit about implications for other sports like soccer, as well as for military veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'll end just with some final thoughts about where I think we need to go from here. So even though CTE has received a lot of press in the last few years, we've actually known about this disorder for a very long time. The first report in the medical literature was written by a forensic pathologist named Harrison Martland, was in Essex County, New Jersey, and he published this paper in 1928 in the Journal of the American Medical Association called Punchdrunk. And I'll just read in case you can't see the small print. It says, "For some time, fans and promoters of boxing have recognized a peculiar condition occurring among prize fighters, which in ring parlance they speak of as punch drunk." And he described the clinical features. These included unsteady walking, mental confusion, slowed responses, both physical and mental, dragging the leg or foot, very masked facial expression similar to Parkinson's disease. Over the next few years, there were a few reports, mainly from boxing, which showed that repeated head trauma was associated with brain degeneration and eventually with specific microscopic changes involving a protein called tau in the brain. And different terms came up through the medical literature. Dementia pugilistica, or the dementia of fighters, is the one that I learned in medical school, and then a term called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which came out in the 1960s. But even though Dr. Martland suggested that the sporting world and the American public and the medical world could not ignore the syndrome of punch drunk, and the association between repeated traumatic brain injury in sports and dementia, this actually remained a fairly obscure area of research in neurology for many years. But really the landscape of CTE research and American football changed dramatically with the publication of this seminal case of chronic traumatic encephalopathy in a National Football League player by Dr. Bennett Omalu. And the case was Iron Mike Webster, a iconic figure in Pittsburgh, very similar to Junior Seau's standing in San Diego. Iron Mike was the center of the Pittsburgh Steelers teams that won 4 Super Bowls in the 1970s. He played for 17 years in the NFL. He was known as an overachiever and as someone who never missed a game, regardless of his physical condition. But in the 10 years following his retirement, Iron Mike suffered devastating psychiatric and neurologic symptoms. At some point, he was penniless, sleeping in train stations or bus stations, and eventually, when he died of a heart attack at age 50, he was cared for by his son, and really required help with most every activity of daily living. He had a severe dementia. He died of a heart attack, and the forensic pathologist on call that day in Pittsburgh was Dr. Bennett Omalu, and there really isn't a more unlikely hero in this saga than Dr. Omalu. He's a Nigerian-born pathologist. He cared so little about football that he didn't even know what the Super Bowl was at the time that Mike Webster's body came in, but he did happen to catch some of the news stories that were shown on TV in Pittsburgh describing Mike Webster and his devastating neurological decline. And by some remarkable coincidence, Dr. Omalu had just completed training in neuropathology at the University of Pittsburgh, really literally months before Mike Webster's case came in. And just a few weeks before, he had performed an autopsy on a woman who had been beaten into a vegetative state by her husband. And so brain trauma was on his mind. And even though this was a very straightforward case of someone who had died of a heart attack, on instinct, really, Dr. Omalu fixed the brain for neuropathologic evaluation. And what he saw when he examined the brain under the microscope really shocked him. He found evidence of this tau protein and really the same pathologic changes that had been described in boxers now in this professional football player. And I can't do justice to this remarkable story, but probably Hollywood can. And so the movie Concussion is premiering on Christmas Day this year. Will Smith is actually playing the role of Bennett Omalu, so I haven't seen the film yet, but it should be interesting. Really dovetailing with Dr. Omalu's first case report were some epidemiologic literature that was now showing that retired American pro football players were at higher risk than the general population for cognitive impairment and depression. And these are 2 studies from a neuroscientist named Kevin Guskowitz at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Guskowitz analyzed the responses to general health questionnaires and cognitive questionnaires from a very large number of retired NFL players. And here are the summary results from 2 big studies. Here you see on the y-axis the percent of players who were diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, reported memory problems, or their spouse or relative reported memory problems as a function of the number of concussions they were known to have in football. And so the white bars show the rates in people who had no concussions. The black bars show the rates in people who had 1 or 2 concussions. And these bars show the rates in players who had had 3 or more concussions. And you can see that the more concussions the players had, the more likely they were to be suffering from cognitive impairment. And a very similar story here with rates of self-reported depression, lower in people with no concussions, a little higher in people with 1 or 2 concussions, and then really quite high in those with 3 or more. And so, in summary, retired players who had 3 or more concussions were 3 to 5 times more likely to report cognitive impairment and 3 times more likely to report depression. And Omalu actually came across Guskowitz's work as he was preparing his initial case report. And so let's take a step back now and talk a little bit about medical definitions of concussion. So concussion is really any injury in which there is sudden jarring of the brain. And this figure here just illustrates some of the biomechanical forces that occur with concussion. But the basic idea is that there's a very rapid acceleration and then a deceleration of the brain. And this includes linear forces as well as rotational forces. And it's actually the rotational forces that in particular may be injurious to the brain. Now, one misconception about concussion is that you actually have to hit your head to have a concussion. That's actually not true. Any event that jars the brain inside this very small enclosed space with the skull, like a blast wave, for example, if you're a soldier, or a whiplash injury if you're in a car accident, anything that jars the brain, even indirectly, can cause a concussion. And while the majority of traumatic brain injuries are due to accidents like falls, there's a very large number, 1.6 to 3.8 million sports-related concussions estimated per year in the US, and this is almost certainly an underestimate. All right, what are the symptoms of concussion? So Dr. Gardner talked about loss of consciousness less than 30 minutes. That's actually quite rare. Fewer than 10% of concussions are associated with loss of consciousness. But people do develop physical symptoms like headache, dizziness, nausea, sensitivity to light and sound. Cognitive symptoms like confusion, mental fogginess, slowed responses, slurring of speech, trouble with focusing or concentrating, losing memory, in particular around the event, as well as psychiatric symptoms, trouble controlling one's emotions, trouble sleeping. These symptoms occur either immediately after the event or sometimes a few minutes or hours later, sometimes only when people are under stress, for example, when they exercise, do they first manifest the symptoms of a concussion. Now, the good news is that most of the time these symptoms go away within a week or shorter amount of time, but about 5 to 10% of the time the symptoms can persist for more than 10 days, and in an even smaller percentage the symptoms can become permanent. What occurs much more frequently, especially in collision sports like football, hockey, and others, are something called subconcussive blows. These are events where the brain is jarred around, but there either are no immediate symptoms after the event, or there are symptoms that don't meet the threshold for diagnosing a concussion. So people might talk about seeing stars for a second or having tunnel vision. The NFL code for this, I've found, is getting your bell rung. Just knowing that your brain has been hit. And when I've asked NFL players how often they get their bell rung when they played football, they kind of laugh because there's no way to estimate. People think that a professional football player may have hundreds to maybe even tens of thousands of these events every season they play. And it turns out that these are also very important events in terms of causing brain injury, most likely. So chronic concussion or a subconcussive blow is an acute event. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE in contrast, is a progressive disorder where the symptoms appear years to decades after the exposure to repetitive mild traumatic brain injury has occurred. But just like concussions, there are really 3 domains of symptoms. So we have cognitive symptoms like memory loss, trouble with concentration and focus, impaired decision-making, impaired judgment. Devastating psychiatric symptoms like depression, explosive behaviors, aggressive, impulsive behavior, drug and alcohol addiction, and really this combination of depression, impulsivity, and alcohol and drugs is a recipe for disaster and for suicide. So there have been quite high rates of suicides in these players. And then there are physical symptoms that range from the headaches and dizziness that you might experience after a concussion to some of the movement problems and motor problems that Dr. Gardner talked about, specifically slow and stiff movements or tremors, as is seen in Parkinson's disease, or even muscle weakness and wasting, as we see in Lou Gehrig's disease. And CTE can be associated with any or a combination of any of these symptoms. Here you see on the left a normal brain post-mortem, and on the right you see a brain of someone who died with CTE. And I'll point out just some of the differences. They may be obvious. One is that the patient with CTE has significant brain atrophy. So here you see the gray matter and the white matter of the healthy brain. You see the gyri, or the peaks of the brain, and the sulci, or the valleys, and you can see that the brain tissue is quite full. In contrast, in this person with CTE, you can see that there's a lot more space between areas of brain tissue. The gyri or peaks are smaller and the sulci or valleys are deeper, so there's brain atrophy. These black areas here are filled with spinal fluid in the living person. These are called the ventricles. And in CTE, you see that in contrast to the collapsed ventricles here in the healthy brain, you see that the ventricles are enlarged or expanded, and that's really spinal fluid filling the space that used to be occupied by brain tissue. But now with atrophy of the brain tissue, the spinal fluid expands to fill that space. And then finally, I'll point out a finding here in a membrane that separates the ventricles and the two sides of the brain called the septum pellucidum. In most people, this is just a single thin membrane. But what happens with repeated traumatic brain injury is that there are tears that occur in that membrane with sudden changes in pressure in the spinal fluid spaces, such that eventually a third space is created. So you see here a single space, and here are the two ventricles. Here's a third space called a cavum septum pellucidum, and this is very often seen also at autopsy in CTE. But the defining feature of CTE is accumulation of a toxic protein called the tau protein in the brain. And what you see in these images is microscopic images of postmortem brain stains so that brown indicates binding of specific antibodies to abnormal deposits of the tau protein. And you can see how full of tau the brain is. Here, for example, is one of the depths of the valleys, the sulci of the brain. You can see the tau accumulating really at the depth of the valley, the depths of the sulcus, in superficial areas, around blood vessels. This is a very unusual distribution of tau that isn't seen in any other condition. What does tau do in the brain? Tau is a protein that's normally present in the brain, and it binds to structures called microtubules. So here's a neuron, a brain cell. You can see the nucleus here. Here's the cell body. Here's the long process by which the neuron communicates with other neurons called the axons. And these blue lines here represent microtubules. The microtubules are part of the cell's cytoskeleton. They provide structure for the cell, and they're also the highway of the cell. Along these microtubules, the cell transports nutrients, energy, DNA, RNA, and the normal function of tau, among other things, is to bind and stabilize these microtubules. Now, traumatic brain injury changes all that, and this is kind of a complicated slide, but let me walk you through what this slide is trying to depict is some of the events in a traumatic brain injury that might lead to abnormal changes and eventually accumulation of the tau protein. So here again, we see our friend the neuron. Here is the axon. The microtubules live in here. And what occurs in a traumatic brain injury is that there's a mechanical force that causes shearing of these axons or breakage of these axons. In addition to that, there are abnormalities that occur in the blood flow to the brain and in something called the blood-brain barrier, or the filter that allows the body to selectively decide which elements of the blood actually make it into the brain. The brain is very shielded from any toxins that are circulating in the blood, but this process is interrupted in a traumatic brain injury. And also, there is massive infiltration of immune cells or inflammation in the brain. And all of these processes lead to changes in chemistry of the neuron, in particular changes in ions like calcium, which can trigger a cascade of very bad events that occur to the cell. I talked about the inflammation and disruption of the blood flow, and eventually this leads to biochemical changes in the tau protein, or addition of little phosphate moieties to the tau protein. So biochemical alterations, and this altered tau is then transformed in a way where eventually it can start to spread through the brain and poison the brain. And it's the spread of the tau protein that really leads to brain degeneration, sometimes years later.
Sounds like cancer.
In a way it is, yeah, the spreading, exactly, and the seeding. And actually, I think this image really illustrates that process. So here is, this is work from Anne McKee, a pathologist at Boston University, who's done really much of the seminal work around CTE in the last 5 to 10 years. And in this image, you'll see tau deposits at different stages of CTE. So people who died with different amounts of tau in the brain after being exposed to traumatic brain injury. In stage 1, it's almost impossible to see the tau. You can see just tiny little deposits. You see that here in the circle. This stage has been found even in people who died at age 17 and 18 and only played high school football. In stage 2, you can start to see more of these little deposits of tau and maybe even some local spread of tau in some of these regions. And the deposits are really occurring primarily in the frontal lobe of the brain, an area that's really responsible for higher order reasoning, decision making, as well as in the brainstem and structures that are incredibly important for regulating mood and behavior. Now in stage 3, you can see even more spreading of these brown spots of tau, also involving now memory areas of the brain in the temporal lobe called the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is a very important area for emotional regulation. People who died with this stage of CT almost always had symptoms. And now in stage 4 CT or advanced CT, you can basically see brownouts. The entire frontal lobe, the temporal lobe is full of tau, and it's spreading into some other brain areas as well. People who had this stage of CT all had dementia. So one question is, how is CTE different from Alzheimer's disease? You've learned in this course that dementia, the end result, can be due to different disease processes. So how are Alzheimer's, which you'll hear about, I guess, in 2 weeks, and CTE different? Well, one of the big differences is that Alzheimer's is defined pathologically by the presence of 2 proteins, amyloid plaques and tau tangles, whereas in CTE, you find only the tau tangles without much amyloid. So that's the big difference. The occurrence of and spread of tau tangles without amyloid is one of the core features of CTE. In addition to that, in Alzheimer's disease, the tau begins in very typical areas in the temporal lobe and memory areas, and then spreads through the brain in a very predictable fashion, whereas in CTE, as you saw in the images I showed you earlier, the tau deposition is very patchy, and it usually begins in the frontal lobes and brainstem, but it's much less predictable and probably depends on exactly where and how people had their traumatic brain injury. And then finally, traumatic brain injury appears to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, but it is always CT is always associated with traumatic brain injury, often with multiple traumatic brain injuries. So there has yet to be a case of CTE in someone who did not have known TBI, and as I said, in many cases, repetitive TBI. A lot of what we know about CTE, we know from a large autopsy study by Anne McKeon and her colleagues, again at Boston University. And in this study, they looked at the brains of 85 patients who had been exposed during life to repeated mild TBI. Now, this was not at all a random sampling of the population. You can see 84 out of the 85 were men, and almost all of them were athletes. Their average age at death was 54, though the range was 14 to 98. And 80% of these people who had been exposed to repeated mild TBI were found to have CTE at autopsy. That included 34 out of 35 pro football players. It was also found in people who had exposure only to high school and college football. Nearly all the boxers, pro hockey players, and 1 out of 2 wrestlers were also found to have CTE at autopsy. In the football players themselves, longer exposure to football or more years of football playing were associated with a higher stage of CTE. Again, this is a correlation, not a causation, but it does suggest a direct link between playing football and developing this pathology. In fact, 89% of the football players had stage 3 or 4 CTE, so a lot of tau in the brain. In this study, however, they didn't find an association between CTE stage and the number of concussions the players were known to have, use of steroids, for example, or the specific position that was played. And you can ask me more about position if you want during the Q&A. Now, while the Anne McKee study really showed there's a strong link between CTE and the tau protein and traumatic brain injury, the story is probably not so simple. This is a study out of the Canadian Football League, a much smaller study that looked at 6 CFL players who had a dementia during life and had a brain autopsy. And in this study, only 3 out of the 6 cases actually had CTE. All the CTE cases also had some other things that were wrong with their brain, like Alzheimer's changes or strokes. And in addition to that, 3 of the players had completely different diseases. So one had pure Alzheimer's disease, one had pure Parkinson's disease, another had Lou Gehrig's disease. And so this study suggests that things might not be so simple as repeated TBI leads always to CTE. In fact, repeated TBI could be a risk factor for a variety of different neurodegenerative diseases. Now, the autopsy studies have really increased our knowledge about CTE, but they also have some inherent limitations. They're not a random sample, not to speak of the population, but even of retired football players. So all these studies rely on brain donation. And if, in fact, families of players who experience neurologic symptoms during life may be more inclined to pursue a brain donation and an autopsy than families of people who had no neurologic symptoms, then that might yield a falsely high rate of CTE in retired football players. So this is something that's known as selection bias. And we really don't know how frequent CTE is even in the NFL, because really a very small proportion of NFL players have been assessed for CTE, and these studies have some inherent biases. Furthermore, the autopsy studies are what we call retrospective, or looking back. So everything that we know about the clinical symptoms these patients had are based on interviews that were conducted after their death. And that can lead to something called recall bias. People might be more likely to remember certain things knowing at the end of the day that their loved one died of CTE. And so this really limits our understanding of the disease course during life. So what we really need are studies to examine these players during life and then follow them over time, as Dr. Gardner described, to see what happens to them neurologically. So since 2011, we at UCSF have been part of something called the NFL Neurological Care Program, where we provide comprehensive evaluations and treatments for retired NFL players. And you can see some of the other centers here. Dr. Gardner has really led a lot of the work describing this cohort, and there are a few punchlines from her work. The first is that the patients in general seem to follow 3 distinct paths. So some of the players we see suffer from something we would consider persistent concussion symptoms. They have recurrent headaches, trouble concentrating, depression, insomnia, memory loss, a lot of the symptoms of the concussions, except the symptoms never went away. They stayed. And in fact, in many of these players, they led to their retirement from the NFL. They began on average 2 years before they retired. The players we see who have these symptoms tend to be really quite young. On average, they're 30 years old. And what really struck us is that even at age 30, they already have 19 years of football exposure. So on average, they started playing football at age 11. And this is particularly important given some suggestions or some data to suggest that younger children are at higher risk of negative consequences of concussions and multiple concussions. A second category of patients really had the kind of mood and behavior symptoms that you read about in the New York Times: violent behavior, mood swings, domestic violence, substance abuse. These individuals on average were about 50 years old, had been retired for 24 years when we saw them, and had 16 years of football exposure. And then yet a third category of players had something that looked like a much more typical cognitive or motor syndrome in an older person. They had progressive memory loss or other cognitive problems to suggest Alzheimer's disease. They had symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And this group was the oldest, though they were quite young to have these symptoms, 60 on average, were about 30 years post-retirement, and had about 17 years of football exposure. So our findings suggest that these players have a variety of different symptoms, and like the Canadian study, that it might not all be CTE, that in fact these players might be at risk for a variety of different neurologic disorders. We also learned, however, that CTE can really present in many different ways and can look during life a lot like Alzheimer's disease. So here you see also from Dr. Gardner's paper, brain autopsy in a person that I cared for during life, a 79-year-old retired player who developed progressive memory loss in late life. He was indistinguishable from the many patients that I care for with Alzheimer's disease. But when he succumbed to his disease and we performed a brain autopsy, we found CTE. We found only the tau protein, not the amyloid protein. So this was not Alzheimer's disease. This was CTE in someone with progressive memory loss. The tau protein was in a different place, though, than Anne McKee had described. It was mainly focused in memory areas of the brain early on, leading to the symptoms of progressive memory loss. It would be good to be able to diagnose people during life, and neuroimaging can be very helpful for that. So this is another of Dr. Gardner's paper looking at MRI as a way of detecting the tearing of this membrane, or the cavum septum pellucidum. Now, I don't know how well this projects in the back of the room, but you can see here a grade 0 cavum septum, basically an intact membrane, and then grade 1, 2, 3, or 4 cavum septum pellucidum, basically increasingly large separation between the leaflets of the membrane. And what Raquel found is that 94% of retired NFL players had a CSP grade of 2 or higher. They had a big cavum septum, a big space in between the membranes, whereas 82% of the non-TBI controls had either grade 0 or grade 1. So this was a small study, but it suggested that this might be an MRI feature that might help us distinguish people who have had repeated traumatic brain injury, maybe have CTE. A lot of the injury in CTE occurs to the white matter of the brain, and there are MRI techniques that allow us to detect changes in the integrity of the white matter. This is a specific MRI sequence called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, and what you see in this figure in red are areas of the brain where retired NFL players with depression or cognitive impairment had significant injury to their white matter compared to normal controls. So you can see that during life, we can detect really quite extensive injury to many of the major white matter pathways. Finally, in the last few years, there have been advances in imaging that allow us to directly detect this pathologic tau protein that deposits in the brain in CTE. And this is done using a technique called a positron emission tomography, or PET scan. The way this works is you inject a small molecule, like this molecule showed here, that's labeled with the radioactive isotope, in this case fluorine-18. You inject this intravenously, and then this small molecule binds to tau protein if it's aggregated and deposited in the brain, and this translates into the red signal that you see here in this retired NFL player, and again shown here with the yellow arrows. So you see increased red signal suggestive possibly of tau deposits here in the temporal lobe, in the depths of the valleys of the frontal lobe, very similar, in fact, to what Anne McKee defined as CTE stage 3. Now, America's favorite sport to watch is football, but actually most children, the most popular sport for children to play recreationally in the US and certainly around the world is soccer. So what about soccer and the brain? What about soccer and CTE? Well, concussions account for about 22% of soccer injuries. They're second only to leg injuries in terms of, the brain is second only to the legs in terms of regions of the body that are susceptible to soccer injuries. But it's usually not the case that the concussion is caused by headers, as you might expect. Rather, the concussions are caused by player-to-player contact, head-to-head contact, foot-to-head. In fact, the most susceptible soccer players are the goalies, who are constantly being run into by other players. They're actually the most susceptible to concussions. What about headers? These have been studied now and suggest that at a professional level, a pro player might perform 6 to 7 headers per game, up to 800 in a professional season. The average speed of the ball when they head the ball is under 65 kilometers per hour, and the acceleration is under 10 Gs. Now, just to put this in perspective, concussion usually occurs at 40 Gs or less. So the headers are occurring, causing significantly less acceleration, deceleration than would typically cause a concussion. So I wish I could tell you that we can conclude from that soccer is entirely safe, since I played a lot of soccer and my children play soccer. However, there have been now a number of reports of professional soccer players who at autopsy have been found to have CTE. This is a report from Leah Grinberg, one of our colleagues, who performed a brain autopsy on Bellini, a very famous Brazilian player, won the World Cup with Pelé in 1958 and 1962, very known especially for his headers. And here you see the now very familiar brown dots and spots indicative of CTE in the brain. What about our military veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan? Actually, Bennett Amalo described the first Iraq war veteran who was exposed to an improvised explosive device and later was found to have CTE. This report is from Lee Goldstein, also telling the story of two war veterans. Both were exposed to IED explosions. Both sustained either confusion or temporary loss of consciousness after the blast. They developed pretty significant headaches, irritability, depression. They died in one case of a brain aneurysm rupture at a young age, and another case, a pneumonia that was due to an analgesic drug overdose. And here you see early stages of CTE found in the brain of these individuals exposed to blasts. So where are we now with CTE? Well, when you think about the scientific method, first we make observations, then we generate a hypothesis based on our observations, and then we need to do experiments to test the hypothesis. And I think with CTE, we're really now at the stage where we've made the hypothesis that repeated brain trauma leads to tau deposition, which over time might lead to a degenerative brain disease. But we have yet to test these hypotheses scientifically. So in the next few years, we're going to see some well-designed prospective studies that are going to address very fundamental questions. How frequent is CTE, even in professional football players, let alone in people who played college football, high school football, soccer? Who is at risk and who isn't? How much traumatic brain injury really puts you at risk for CTE? Which factors, genetic or other, might modify the risk? What are the molecular mechanisms by which repeated TBI leads to CTE or other disorders? I think at the same time, we're going to see major advances in our ability to measure some of the important biological processes of CTE, not after death at the time of autopsy, but during life. And I've given you some imaging techniques that can help us measure tau deposits, white matter injury, inflammation, and amyloid. I think these biological markers or biomarkers are really going to revolutionize the field by enabling us to make a diagnosis during life, not after death. And they're going to transform, I think, our understanding of the human disease. As we wait for more science, though, our current focus should really be on prevention. We're already seeing some of this. I think it's not moving fast enough. But I think we need to think about major changes in the rules which will minimize the risk of individuals, particularly children who are playing these sports. There's a lot of focus on technologies to try to prevent the brain. Helmets, for example, that might prevent some of the acceleration and deceleration. A helmet does not prevent a concussion. In football, a helmet prevents a skull fracture, it prevents a brain contusion or bleed. But actually, many players who were raised in the 60s or 70s were taught to tackle leading with their head, to use their head as a weapon, and to tackle the runner under their chin, basically to hyperextend the runner's neck to stop the runner. So they were actually maximizing, I think, their subconcussive blows in what was considered at the time to be proper tackling technique. I also think, and I think we're seeing some of this, some increased awareness and vigilance around concussions. You are seeing this, I think, to some degree at the professional level, but it's still amazing how few, for example, high schools have professional trainers trained to assess concussions on the field during high school football games. So I think there's a lot more we need to do and can do in terms of prevention as we wait for more definitive science. So I've already taken too long. I'd like to thank many people who have helped with this research and others. In particular, I want to recognize Raquel, Bruce Miller, Mitch Berger, Leah Grinberg, Joel Kramer, Kate Poseen, David Perry. These are individuals who have been very active in our TBI and NFL program. Acknowledge my lab members and funding sources. Thank you very much. So I think we have about 15 minutes now for questions and answers. Dr. Gardner, if you could come up and please go ahead, raise your hand and say your name and your question. Yes, sir.
Great question. So the question is, in the study that I discussed looking at the risk of dementia and Parkinson's disease after a single TBI sustained in older adulthood, did we look at mild versus more severe traumatic brain injuries? And we did. We actually found a very interesting, what's called an interaction between the severity of the traumatic brain injury and age, which is that for the younger members of the study who were maybe in their 50s, a mild TBI did not increase their risk of dementia or Parkinson's disease over the next few years. But with increasing age, the risk of dementia we really found this for the dementia outcome. So risk of dementia after a mild traumatic brain injury increased to the point that by the time you were looking at the 85 and older age group, a mild traumatic brain injury imparted as much risk for dementia as a very severe traumatic brain injury. Does that make sense? Great.
So the question is about outcomes in children who suffer from shaken baby syndrome. Basically, their heads are jiggled. There can be devastating neurologic injury that occurs from that. Whether there's any evidence that if I understood the question correctly, that shaken baby syndrome can years later cause CTE or a related condition. I am not aware of literature about that, but I'm not an authority on that, so I'm not sure I know the answer to the question, but I'm not aware of any such literature. So the question is whether you can clear tau from the brain if you can detect it on the scan. Juice doesn't work as far as I'm not sure it's been tested. But absolutely, I think there is a lot of interest in developing therapies that clear tau from the brain, change it from this abnormal state back to its normal state, prevent its spread across the brain. Tau is also very important in Alzheimer's disease, as you'll hear in a couple of weeks. And there is fortunately a lot of interest now in developing therapies around tau. This could have implications for CTE, for Alzheimer's, and other conditions as well.
So the question is, can really vigorous exercise with a lot of jumping potentially cause brain injury that would manifest as psychiatric symptoms or other symptoms? And so as far as I know, there haven't been reports simply of a person jumping or doing vigorous aerobic exercise leading to any of these conditions. However, there have been a couple of reports of self-inflicted repeated subconcussive or concussive injuries, particularly in children. I think there's been at least one report in a child with head-banging behavior who perhaps had autism, who was later found to have CTE. But that person was probably really banging their head against something quite hard. So just from jumping, I haven't come across anything to that effect.
Exercise is really good for the brain. Sorry. It really is a function of the magnitude of the forces and the frequency. And so you're measuring acceleration and deceleration in g-forces. And, when you exercise or jumping and so on, the g-forces really are just not even near the threshold, I think, that could cause any significant injury to the brain. That said, and this comes back to positions. Certain positions in football, for example, are prone to very high impact hits, very high g-forces, over 150 g's sometimes are measured. And these are high impact collisions. For example, a wide receiver who's tackled, aggressively. On the other hand, there are certain positions like the linemen who have very frequent collisions, basically head to head on every snap of the ball, though the g-forces are much smaller. And it seems to be that the integral of the overall exposure is probably what's important for developing risk for CTE. So if you have very frequent subconcussive blows, or if you have less frequent but very high impact blows, it seems to be that you can reach CTE by either one of those courses. So the question is if stopping to run very abruptly, for example, in a sporting event, could lead to those kinds of g-force. The answer is no. They really occur from collisions. A hit, or it can be a blast wave in the case of a soldier, or a whiplash injury, but people just don't move that fast. So running, stopping, all that doesn't cause nearly the kind of forces that might injure the brain. A blast wave, when there's a blast, there's actually a wave of energy that comes from the detonation. And so you see, if you've seen, maybe in person or in the movies, someone just, sent backwards after a blast. That's an actual force of wave, and that hits the brain, and it leads to jiggling of the brain, acceleration, deceleration. The question is whether, as we appreciate that many of these brain diseases have psychiatric features, depression, anxiety, PTSD, psychotic features, is there more interdisciplinary cooperation between psychology, psychiatry, and neurology? The answer is there should be. Certainly the players that I see, for example, with CTE, but also many of the patients that I see with Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, other brain diseases, have psychiatric symptoms. And in many cases, I refer them to a psychiatrist, and we take care of the patients together, with one of us really focusing more on the cognitive neurologic side and the other on the psychiatry side. So, the division between psychiatry and neurology is really arbitrary, I think, and based on history more than anything else. And I think more and more these fields are going to merge together. They should.
So the question is, does someone with a pre-existing psychiatric condition such as depression, are they more susceptible to having more problems after traumatic brain injury? So I think that this is an area of active investigation, particularly in some of the studies that we're both involved with. Preliminarily, it seems like that's possible, that having pre-existing conditions would make it more likely that you'd have either worsening of those conditions or that you may be just more susceptible to those sorts of conditions that could be exacerbated by traumatic brain injury. But it's definitely an area of active investigation. And I think that it may prove to be a number of factors that people might have that are pre-existing before traumatic brain injury that might make certain people very vulnerable, sort of pre-existing either genetic or pre-existing medical factors that make them more susceptible to having worse outcomes after a TBI. So the question is, to what degree can injury from a traumatic brain injury be exacerbated, I think, by also having carbon monoxide exposure? From carbon monoxide, a chemical exposure. Got it. Yeah, so that would be a very different type of injury. Some people I've discovered, in fact, even within the VA medical system would categorize that perhaps as a traumatic brain injury, but the mechanisms are so vastly different that the outcomes, the risk for neurodegenerative disease would be expected to be vastly different as well. And at this point, those injuries haven't been studied on as grand a scale, as far as I know, as traumatic brain injury, simply because the numbers are quite a bit smaller. So I think it's hard to say. I don't know if you have anything to add.
It certainly comes up a lot. For example, in the football players, there are many substances that have been in their body that are not good for the brain. And the question is whether these synergize with a traumatic brain injury or modify the risk or actually are directly responsible for some of the symptoms. And the answer is we don't know. There's no clear evidence one way or the other. Similar story with war veterans, potentially exposed to toxins during the different wars, and still an open-ended question, I would say.
One last quick comment on the synergy between these factors. So there's really interesting emerging evidence about how certain toxins can actually synergize with traumatic brain injury, and this has been specifically shown by one of the faculty here at UCSF, Carly Tanner, in the Parkinson's disease group, that having exposure to certain pesticides and then having a traumatic brain injury sort of makes it even more likely that you'll then be at risk for Parkinson's disease later than having either of those exposures alone or even adding the risk from either. So there seems to be some synergy where the sum of those two parts is actually greater than each individual part is added together.
All right, last question. Person in the back row, you've had your hand up for a long time. The question is, if a brain surgery is considered a TBI, depends if you ask the neurologist or the neurosurgeon. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your attention.